Today, if you look at a map of the world, Britain seems almost comically small. It's a rainy collection of islands off the coast of Europe, roughly the size of Michigan, with a population that would barely fill half of Mexico City. You could drive the entire length of England in a day if traffic cooperates. And yet, at its height in the early 20th century, the British Empire controlled approximately a quarter of the Earth's land surface and ruled over 450 million people. 1 out of every 4 humans on the planet lived under the British flag. The sun, famously, never set on British territory because their possessions were so scattered across the globe that it was always daytime somewhere in the empire. If you're using this to fall asleep, that's literally why I make these. So subscribe maybe and tell me where you are and what time. I check comments and it's like Sydney at sunset, Seattle at midnight, all at once. How did this happen? How does a kingdom that spent most of the medieval period getting invaded by Vikings, Normans, and basically anyone with a boat somehow end up controlling Canada, India, Australia, huge chunks of Africa, islands scattered across every ocean, and territories on every inhabited continent? Was it destiny, geography, superior technology, ruthless ambition, dumb luck, or something stranger, some combination of factors that came together in a way that's never quite been repeated? That's the question we're going to explore tonight. And I mean really explore. This isn't going to be a simple story of good guys and bad guys, of inevitable progress or pure evil. It's going to be complicated, messy, often uncomfortable, and sometimes genuinely weird. Because the real story of how Britain became a global empire isn't the one you learned in school. It's stranger, more contingent, more violent, and more human than the simplified versions allow. We're going to start in medieval England, a backwater kingdom that couldn't even fully control its own island. We'll watch as it stumbles into overseas exploration decades after Spain and Portugal have already carved up the New World. We'll see how pirates and merchants, often indistinguishable from each other, began building something that nobody quite planned. We'll follow the rise of the East India Company, a corporation that somehow ended up ruling 300 million people. We'll track the wars with France, Spain, and the Netherlands that turned scattered trading posts into a genuine empire. And we'll see how losing America somehow led to gaining much of the rest of the world. By the way, if you enjoy this kind of deep historical storytelling, we recently published a book exploring the strangest secrets of prehistoric humanity. You can find it at sleepytimehistory.com, so settle in. This is going to be a long journey through centuries of ambition, innovation, exploitation, and transformation. The story of a tiny island that, for better and worse, changed the entire world. Let's go back to the beginning. Not the beginning of empire, but the beginning of England itself. Because here's the thing, nobody tells you about the nation that would eventually conquer a quarter of the planet. For most of its early history, England was the one getting conquered. The Romans arrived in 43 AD and stayed for nearly 4 centuries, building roads and walls and cities, imposing their language and laws on the Celtic tribes they found there. Then they left, pulling their legions back to defend a crumbling empire, and Britain collapsed into chaos almost immediately. The Romano-British population, accustomed to imperial administration, suddenly found themselves defenceless against waves of new invaders. The Anglo-Saxons came next, not as a single invasion force but as a slow flood of Germanic tribes, Angles, Saxons, Jutes, crossing the North Sea in waves throughout the 5th and 6th centuries. They didn't just conquer the island, they reshaped it completely, pushing the native Celtic populations to the western fringes, establishing new kingdoms, bringing new languages that would eventually evolve into English. For 3 centuries, these Anglo-Saxon kingdoms fought each other constantly, briefly unifying under strong kings before fracturing again into civil war. Then came the Vikings. Starting in 793 with the raid on Lindisfarne, Norse raiders systematically devastated the English coast, eventually conquering and settling huge portions of northern and eastern England. The Danelaw, they called it, and for a time it looked like England might become a Scandinavian possession entirely. Only the desperate resistance of Alfred the Great and his successors kept a remnant of Anglo-Saxon England alive in the south. By the year 1000, England had been conquered and reconquered so many times that invasion was practically a national tradition. The population was a genetic and cultural mixture of Celts, Romans, Anglo-Saxons and Vikings. Multiple languages competed for dominance. Political unity was fragile at best. And then came the conquest that would change everything. 1066. William the Conqueror, Duke of Normandy, lands at Pevensey with an army of Norman knights and archers. Harold Godwinson, the last Anglo-Saxon king, marches south to meet him, after just defeating a massive Viking invasion in the north. The two armies collide at Hastings, and by the end of the day, Harold is dead. An arrow through the eye according to tradition, and the Anglo-Saxon elite is shattered. What follows is one of the most complete transfers of power in medieval history. William doesn't just take the throne. He systematically replaces the entire Anglo-Saxon aristocracy with Norman nobles. He commissions the Domesday Book, a comprehensive survey of every piece of property in England, the kind of administrative achievement that would have made the Romans proud. He builds castles everywhere, stone fortresses that physically dominate the landscape and remind the conquered English exactly who's in charge now. But here's where it gets interesting. The Norman conquest created something that hadn't existed before, a genuinely centralized state. The Norman kings ruled England with an iron fist, but they also gave it unity, a single legal system, a functioning bureaucracy, the administrative infrastructure that would eventually allow a small island kingdom to project power across oceans. The Normans also gave England something else, continental ambitions. Because William and his successors didn't just rule England, they held vast territories in France, often more valuable than their English holdings. This created a strange dual identity that would define English politics for centuries. The Norman elite spoke French, married French nobles, spent much of their time in their French domains. England was important, but it was just one piece of a cross-channel empire. This tension erupted into open conflict in what we now call the 100 Years' War, though it actually lasted 116 years from 1337 to 1453. English kings claimed the French throne. French kings tried to confiscate English territories. Armies marched back and forth across France for over a century in a conflict that devastated the French countryside and slowly, painfully, forged a distinct English national identity. Because here's the paradox. England became England by trying to conquer France and failing. By the time England finally limped out of the 100 Years' War in 1453, exhausted and defeated, the world was already changing. While English nobles had been slaughtering each other over French territories, Portuguese sailors had been quietly revolutionizing navigation. They'd been pushing down the African coast year by year, voyage by voyage, mapping currents and winds, establishing trading posts, figuring out the maritime secrets that would crack open the world. Spain was watching, learning, preparing. And in 1492, while England was barely recovering from the Wars of the Roses, Christopher Columbus made landfall in the Caribbean and changed human history forever. Within a year, Pope Alexander VI issued a papal bull that literally drew a line down the middle of the Atlantic. Everything west of it belonged to Spain, everything east to Portugal. The Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494 formalized this arrangement. Two nations, blessed by papal authority, had divided the entire unknown world between themselves. England wasn't even invited to the negotiation. Think about that for a moment. The two great Catholic powers sat down and carved up the planet like it was a piece of property, and nobody thought to include England in the conversation. It wasn't an oversight. It was a statement. England simply didn't matter in global affairs. It was a minor kingdom on the periphery of Europe, still bleeding from decades of civil war, too poor and too distracted to care about distant oceans. The Wars of the Roses had done more than kill off rival nobles. They'd gutted the English economy, destroyed trade networks, turned the kingdom inward. While Portuguese merchants were establishing direct trade routes to India, and Spanish conquistadors were toppling empires in Mexico and Peru, England was trying to figure out which nobleman had the best claim to wear the crown. The country was broke. The nobility was decimated, and the new Tudor dynasty that emerged in 1485 had more pressing concerns than exploration. Henry VII, the first Tudor king, was obsessed with legitimacy and survival. His claim to the throne was questionable at best. He'd won it by killing Richard III at Bosworth Field, which is a perfectly medieval way to acquire a kingdom, but it doesn't inspire confidence in dynastic stability. He spent most of his reign consolidating power, crushing rebellions, arranging strategic marriages, filling the treasury that civil war had emptied. But he did make one interesting move. In 1497, he sponsored an Italian navigator named John Cabot to sail west across the Atlantic, not south around Africa like the Portuguese, not southwest to the Caribbean like Columbus, but straight west into the unknown. Cabot made landfall somewhere on the coast of Newfoundland, claimed it for England, and returned with tales of seas so thick with cod that you could catch them in baskets. It was England's first tentative step into the age of exploration, and then nothing happened. Henry VII didn't send follow-up expeditions. He didn't establish colonies. He didn't really do anything with Cabot's discovery except note it in the official records. The Spanish were conquering the Aztecs. The Portuguese were establishing trading empires in Asia, and England was fishing off Newfoundland. This wasn't incompetence exactly. It was priorities. England was poor compared to Spain, with its American gold, and Portugal with its Asian spices. England had neither the capital nor the infrastructure for ambitious overseas ventures. More importantly, England was distracted by something that would prove far more consequential than any early exploration. The English Reformation changed everything. When Henry VIII broke with Rome in the 1530s, ostensibly over his divorce but really over power and money, he didn't just create a new church, he fundamentally reoriented England's position in the world. Overnight, England went from being a minor Catholic kingdom to a Protestant nation in a violently Catholic continent. Spain and France, the superpowers of the age, were both Catholic. The Pope, who had divided the world between Spain and Portugal, now declared the English king a heretic. The Treaty of Tordesillas was a papal decree. Protestant England didn't recognise papal authority, which meant, from the English perspective, the treaty was meaningless. Spain and Portugal might claim to own the Atlantic and everything beyond it, but England no longer accepted that they had any right to make such claims. The Reformation didn't just free England from Rome, it freed English ships to sail wherever they wanted. But this freedom came with isolation. England was now a heretic nation, an outsider, surrounded by hostile Catholic powers who would happily see it destroyed. When Mary I briefly returned England to Catholicism in the 1550s, she married Philip II of Spain, and for a moment it looked like England might become a Spanish satellite. But Mary died childless, and her Protestant half-sister Elizabeth inherited a kingdom that was isolated, vulnerable, and very, very angry. Elizabeth I's England had a chip on its shoulder. It was Protestant in a Catholic world, poor compared to Spain's American wealth, excluded from the great game of empire by papal decree. But it was also free from the constraints that limited Catholic nations, and it was hungry to prove itself, hungry to compete with Spain, hungry to take what it had been denied. This psychological shift mattered more than any material advantage. England went from being a kingdom focused on its internal struggles and continental ambitions to a nation looking outward across the Atlantic, not because it was suddenly wealthy or powerful, but because it was desperate to compete with rivals who had gotten there first. The age of exploration was already well underway when England finally decided to join. Spain had conquered empires. Portugal had reached Asia. France was exploring North America. England was late to the party, underfunded, outmatched, and utterly determined to crash it anyway. What happened next would require something more than royal expeditions and official colonies. It would require pirates, privateers, and a war that would transform England from a second-rate power into something the world had never seen before. Elizabeth I couldn't afford a navy, not a proper one, not the kind that could challenge Spain's massive war fleets. The royal treasury was perpetually empty, drained by years of religious turmoil and the constant threat of invasion. But England needed to hit back at Spain somehow, needed to disrupt the flow of American silver that was funding Spanish armies across Europe. So Elizabeth did something brilliant and completely deniable. She turned England's merchants and sea captains into pirates. Not pirates exactly, privateers. The distinction mattered legally, if not practically. A pirate was a criminal, an outlaw, someone any nation could hang without consequence. A privateer was a private ship owner with a royal license, a letter of marque, authorizing them to attack enemy vessels and keep most of the loot. It was plausible deniability made into foreign policy. When Francis Drake raided Spanish ports and treasure ships, Elizabeth could claim he was acting independently. When Spain complained, she could express shock at his unauthorized behavior, and when Drake returned with holds full of Spanish silver, she could quietly take her share of the profits. Drake was the perfect instrument for this policy. Born into poverty in Devon, he'd worked his way up through the maritime world through competence and absolute ruthlessness. He despised Spain with personal intensity. On an early trading voyage to the Caribbean, Spanish forces had attacked his fleet, killed his kinsman, and left him for dead. He never forgot. Every raid afterward was partly business and partly revenge. In 1577, Drake set out on a voyage that would become legendary. The official story was that he was exploring trade routes to the Pacific. The real mission was to raid Spanish settlements along the undefended Pacific coast of South America, places the Spanish assumed were safe because they were on the wrong side of the continent. Drake sailed around the tip of South America, then north into the Pacific, hitting Spanish ports that had never seen an enemy ship. He captured treasure vessels that didn't even have weapons, because who would attack them here? The panic was extraordinary. Spanish colonial authorities suddenly realized their entire Pacific coast was vulnerable. They'd built their American empire assuming the Atlantic was the only approach that mattered. Drake had just proved them catastrophically wrong. He sailed north all the way to California, claimed it for England in a ceremony the Spanish would have found hilarious if they'd known about it, then crossed the Pacific to Asia and returned home around Africa. He'd circumnavigated the globe. More importantly, he'd returned with so much Spanish treasure that his investors made a 4,700% profit. Elizabeth knighted him on the deck of his ship. It was the most aggressive diplomatic middle finger imaginable. Spain demanded Drake's execution as a pirate. Elizabeth made him a knight and a hero. The message was clear. England might not be strong enough to fight Spain directly, but it could bleed the Spanish Empire slowly, ship by ship, port by port, treasure fleet by treasure fleet. John Hawkins was doing something similar, building a network of traders and raiders in the Caribbean. Walter Raleigh was organising expeditions to North America, searching for territories England could claim before Spain expanded north from Mexico. These weren't naval officers following orders from the Admiralty. They were entrepreneurs, investors, sea captains operating in a grey zone between trade and warfare. They were also training a generation of English sailors in navigation, ship handling and combat at sea. Learning by doing, learning by raiding. Spain couldn't tolerate it forever. By the mid-1580s, Philip II had decided that England had to be destroyed, not just defeated, but conquered and forcibly returned to Catholicism. He began assembling the largest naval force Europe had ever seen, the Spanish Armada. 130 ships, 30,000 men. The plan was to sail up the English Channel, meet with the Spanish army waiting in the Netherlands, ferry that army across to England, and crush Elizabeth's heretic kingdom in a single overwhelming invasion. When the Armada finally appeared off the English coast in July 1588, it must have seemed unstoppable. The Spanish galleons were massive floating fortresses, towering over the smaller English ships. But the English had learned things during their years of privateering. Their ships were faster, more manoeuvrable, built for sailing rather than just carrying soldiers. Their gun crews had been trained in actual combat, not just practice drills, and they had Drake, Hawkins and a cadre of captains who'd spent the last decade figuring out how to fight Spanish ships and win. The English didn't try to board and capture the Spanish vessels. That was the Spanish plan, to grapple enemy ships and let their superior numbers of soldiers win the day. Instead, the English stayed at range, using their superior manoeuvrability to pepper the Spanish fleet with cannon fire. They sent fire ships, unmanned vessels set ablaze and sent drifting into the anchored Spanish fleet, creating chaos and forcing the Armada to cut their anchors and scatter. When the Spanish finally tried to regroup and escape north around Scotland, storms battered them mercilessly. More than half the fleet never made it home. But here's what's important to understand. The Armada's defeat didn't instantly make England a great power. Spain was still wealthier, still controlled most of the Americas, still had the largest army in Europe. The war between England and Spain continued for another 16 years. What changed was psychological. Spanish invincibility was a myth now, and everyone knew it. England had faced the greatest military power in the world and survived. More than survived. They'd proven that Spain's American empire was vulnerable, that Spanish ships could be beaten, that all that gold and silver flowing across the Atlantic could be intercepted. Other nations noticed. Dutch rebels fighting for independence from Spain took heart. French Protestants gained confidence. The balance of European power began to shift in ways that wouldn't become obvious for decades. But England was still figuring out what to do with its newfound confidence. Walter Raleigh's attempts to establish a colony on Roanoke Island off North Carolina ended in mysterious failure. The colonists simply vanished, leaving behind only the word Croatoan carved into a post. Nobody knows what happened to them. Disease, conflict with native populations, starvation, some combination of all three. The point is that establishing overseas colonies was hard, far harder than raiding Spanish ships. Yet something had shifted in English culture. Maritime adventure had become fashionable, even noble. Where once the path to glory led through continental wars and feudal politics, now young men dreamed of oceanic voyages and distant shores. Investors were forming joint stock companies to fund expeditions, spreading the risk and the potential profits among many shareholders. The machinery of empire was being invented by merchants and sailors who couldn't afford to wait for royal sponsorship. They were still looking for gold, still chasing the fantasy of finding what Spain had found in Mexico and Peru. They hadn't yet figured out that England's path to empire would be completely different, that it would run through trade and settlement rather than conquest and plunder. But they were learning. Every failed colony, Every captured Spanish ship, every voyage into unknown waters taught them something new. The world was opening up. And England, late to the game and desperate to catch up, was developing the skills and the hunger that would eventually let it surpass everyone who'd gotten there first. By the early 1600s, the age of daring raids and failed experiments like Roanoke had taught England one thing very clearly. You couldn't build an empire on bravado alone. You needed something more durable than a pirate raid or a half-starved outpost that vanished without explanation. You needed a foothold, a place where English people could live, not just land, grab treasure and sail away. So in 1606, a group of London investors tried something new with something very old at its core, a business venture. They called it the Virginia Company. On paper, it was almost boring, a joint stock company. People bought shares, pooled money, and in return got a percentage of whatever profits came back from America. No gold mines yet, no silver mountains, just an expectation that somewhere on that long unknown coastline there had to be wealth to rival Spain's. The Virginia Company's instructions were optimistic to the point of delusion. Find a good harbour, search for gold and silver, establish trade with the locals, maybe locate a passage to the Pacific while you're at it. Oh, and try not to get wiped out. In December 1606, 3 small ships set out. The Susan Constant, the Godspeed, and the Discovery. About 100 men and boys on board. No women. No farmers, really. Lots of gentlemen who had never worked a day with their hands. Some craftsmen, a few labourers, a handful of soldiers. It was less a community than a speculative project wrapped around a cannon. They reached the Chesapeake in the spring of 1607 and pushed up a river the English would later name the James. They picked a swampy peninsula for their new settlement, partly because it was defensible, partly because they didn't understand what they were choosing. Brackish water, mosquitoes, summer heat like a wet blanket, winter cold that cut straight through wooden walls. They named it Jamestown, after their king, as if a royal name could ward off hunger. The first months were an education in reality. There was no gold. The men were unaccustomed to planting and harvesting in this climate. Supply ships were irregular and often delayed. Food ran out, then ran thin, then became an obsession. The colonists fell sick from water that turned foul as the tides pushed salt upstream. They quarrelled with each other. They quarrelled with the Powhatan people, whose territories they had just walked into with an air of entitlement and ignorance. The historical records call one winter the starving time. It sounds almost poetic until you understand what it meant. The population shrank from several hundred to about 60. Reports from survivors mention eating horses, dogs, rats, shoe leather. There are hints of worse, whispered even in contemporary documents. Desperation that stripped away all the polite illusions of English civility. Jamestown survived not because it was well planned, but because it was just lucky enough, just stubborn enough, and just connected enough to English money to keep getting more bodies shipped over. Reinforcements arrived, fresh supplies, new leaders, some of them more realistic than the original dreamers, and crucially, a new crop, tobacco. It wasn't gold, but it behaved like gold in the ledgers. Native peoples had been using tobacco for centuries, but an Englishman named John Rolfe began experimenting with sweeter Caribbean varieties that European smokers preferred. The plant loved Virginia's soil. Soon, instead of hunting for mythical mines, colonists were hacking down forests to plant rolling fields of leaves. Tobacco turned Jamestown from a failing experiment into a going concern. It didn't cure the colony's misery, but it gave it a reason to keep existing. Planters needed labour, more land, more workers to grow more tobacco to ship back to London. The Virginia Company finally saw a potential return on its investment. But this was only one model of colonisation. While Jamestown clawed its way toward profitability, another group of English settlers was dreaming of a very different kind of new world. In 1620, a small ship left England with an even smaller group of religious dissidents. They weren't investors. They weren't backed by a major joint stock company with grand profit calculations. They were separatists, later remembered as the Pilgrims, people who believed the Church of England was so corrupt that it couldn't be reformed from within. They'd tried living in the Netherlands for a while, but life there was precarious. So they formed a deal with London merchants, secured a patent and boarded a ship called the Mayflower. About 100 people, families this time, women, children, elderly parents. Not an expeditionary force, but a portable community. Their voyage was miserable. Storms, leaks, cramped conditions. When they finally sighted land, they were off course, hundreds of miles north of where they were technically supposed to settle. Their patent didn't apply here. Legal authority was fuzzy. Some of the passengers, not being part of the core religious group, started muttering that the rules no longer bound them. So before anyone set foot on shore, they did something quietly revolutionary. They wrote an agreement, a compact, a promise that they would form a civil body politic, make laws together, and obey them for the good of the colony. It was a practical solution to an immediate crisis, hammered out in a cold, cramped ship's cabin. But it planted a seed, the idea that communities across the ocean might govern themselves, not as royal fiefdoms, but as self-organised societies under a distant crown. They called their settlement Plymouth. Where Jamestown had been founded on commerce and royal charters, Plymouth rested on shared belief and mutual obligation. It didn't make them immune to suffering. The first winter killed nearly half of them. They depended heavily on local Wampanoag people for food, knowledge, and fragile political alliances. The famous story of a welcoming Thanksgiving glosses over the underlying reality. Both sides were making hard calculations about survival, security, and advantage. Jamestown and Plymouth looked utterly different on the surface. One was a swampy outpost run by profit-seeking gentlemen. The other was a rocky settlement of religious families promising to live by their own rules. But together they hinted at what England's Atlantic Empire was becoming, a patchwork of colonies, each founded for its own reasons, money, God, or sheer desperation, but all feeding into a wider web of power. Once those first fragile settlements took root, growth along the eastern seaboard became almost explosive. The Massachusetts Bay Company launched a much larger Puritan migration in the 1630s, building a society that saw itself as a city upon a hill, a moral example to the world. Other colonies followed, Maryland as a haven for Catholics, the Carolinas with grand plantation dreams, Pennsylvania as a Quaker experiment in tolerance and trade. In each case, joint stock logic lingered in the background. Many of these colonies began as corporate ventures, with shareholders and charters, marketing pamphlets and recruitment drives. Empire didn't arrive as a centralized royal plan. It seeped outward through companies, contracts, and colonists chasing livelihoods or salvation. The crown often played catch-up, granting or revoking charters, trying to impose order on realities that merchants and migrants had already created. But if the mainland colonies grew steadily, the Caribbean exploded. Tiny islands like Barbados, Jamaica, and Antigua were, in some ways, England's real treasure. Here, settlers discovered a crop far more lucrative than tobacco, sugar. It required enormous capital investment, mills, boilers, specialized equipment, and back-breaking labour in a brutal climate. If Jamestown was a lesson in improvisation, the Sugar Islands were laboratories in industrialized agriculture. Planters quickly realized they couldn't rely on indentured servants from England, people who worked for a few years in exchange for passage, because too many died, and those who survived expected land at the end of their term. Sugar demanded a workforce that could be controlled indefinitely, generation after generation. So the English, like the Portuguese and Spanish before them, turned increasingly to Africa. By the late 1600s, English merchants were deeply embedded in the transatlantic slave trade. Joint stock companies didn't just fund colonies now. They funded slave forts on the African coast, fleets of ships carrying kidnapped men, women and children across the Atlantic, and insurance schemes to spread the risk of losses at sea. Human beings were reduced to entries in account books, valued not for their lives but for their ability to survive the Middle Passage and labour in the cane fields. On the Sugar Islands, mortality rates among enslaved Africans were horrifying. Overwork, disease, punishment. The plantations devoured lives faster than they could be replaced naturally, so more ships came, more captives, more profit. The wealth was staggering. Sugar flowed to England. Rum, molasses and tobacco moved in complex triangles between Europe, Africa and the Americas. The emerging British Empire began to rest, financially, on slavery. And yet, if you zoomed in on the ground level, the grand patterns of commerce and empire dissolve into something messier and far more human. Imagine stepping ashore as an early colonist. The air is thick and unfamiliar. In Virginia it smells of wet earth, rot and wood smoke. In New England of pine resin and cold salt. In Barbados it's hot and sweet and suffocating. The nights are full of insect noise and animal cries you don't recognize. The stars are the same, but everything else is wrong. You're far from home, dependent on strangers whose language you don't speak, whose relationship to this land is deeper than you can fathom. Sometimes that relationship takes the form of cautious trade, corn for iron tools, furs for cloth. Sometimes it looks like uneasy truces, alliances against rival tribes or rival colonies. Sometimes, as English ambitions expand and land hunger grows, it erupts into violence, massacres, burning fields, and shattered communities on both sides. Disease runs ahead of everything. European pathogens tear through indigenous populations with catastrophic speed. Old world illnesses, meeting immune systems that have never encountered them before. The scale of loss is almost impossible to grasp. Entire villages emptied. Political structures destabilized. Spiritual worlds shattered. In many places, English colonists walk into landscapes already reeling from epidemics they never saw, and mistake emptiness for opportunity. For the settlers themselves, the moral world becomes slippery. People who left England praying for religious freedom find themselves justifying the seizure of native lands as God's will. Investors who talk about improving wilderness landscapes sign contracts that treat other human beings as cargo. Ordinary labourers, desperate not to starve, accept systems of indenture that bind them almost like property. Over time, racial lines harden. Laws are written that distinguish sharply between white servants and black slaves, freezing inequalities into legal codes. This is where the roots of Atlantic Empire really sink in, not just in charters and royal proclamations, but in daily compromises, in the fear of another winter like the last one, in the choice to clear one more field of corn planted by someone else's ancestors, in the decision to buy cheaper sugar and not ask why it was so cheap. Jamestown, Plymouth, the Sugar Islands, these were not yet the polished, confident empire of later centuries. They were improvisations, survival strategies, business plans scratched onto fragile paper. But through them, England was learning how to rule at a distance, how to turn land and labour into wealth on a global scale, and how to weave violence, belief, and commerce into a single imperial fabric. The pirates had shown that Spain could be robbed. The colonies were beginning to show that England could build something of its own, messy, brutal, often fragile but growing. And far to the east, another experiment in empire was taking shape, one that would push this logic of profit and power to an entirely new level. a trading company that would end up conquering a subcontinent. The story begins, as so many English imperial stories do, not with a drumroll of conquest, but with paperwork. On the last day of the year 1600, a group of London merchants secured a royal charter from Queen Elizabeth I. Their goal sounded modest enough: the exclusive right to trade with the East Indies, meaning the rich spice lands of Asia. They called themselves, in the long-winded style of the age, the Governor and Company of Merchants of London trading into the East Indies. Everyone else just called it the East India Company. At first it was simply another joint stock venture, not so different in structure from the Virginia Company or the groups backing sugar plantations in the Caribbean. Investors put up money. Ships were built and armed. Crews were hired. The hope was that they would sail out, buy spices, silks and cottons, and sell them back in London for a handsome profit. The spices were important: nutmeg, cloves, pepper. These weren't just flavours, they were preservatives, medicines, status symbols. Control over spice routes could make kingdoms rich. The Portuguese and the Dutch were already in the game. England was late again, showing up after more established powers had carved out the best harbours and trade monopolies. So the East India Company improvised, unable to muscle the Dutch aside in the Indonesian Spice Islands. They started looking for other opportunities. They followed the currents and monsoon winds up into the Indian Ocean, along coasts that had been part of thriving trade networks for centuries before the first English hull appeared on the horizon. India, at this time, was not a blank space waiting to be filled. It was one of the richest, most sophisticated regions on earth. The Mughal Empire, founded by Central Asian conquerors in the 1500s, towered over the subcontinent. At its height, it commanded more people than all of Western Europe combined, and its elite lived in a world of marble palaces, jewelled thrones, and finely woven textiles that dazzled visitors. The English were late, small, and very aware of it. Their first steps were cautious. In 1612, after some skirmishes with the Portuguese, the company secured permission from the Mughal authorities to build a trading post at Surat on India's western coast. It wasn't a conquest. It was a negotiated foothold, a warehouse, a few offices, some defensive works. In return, the company paid customs, respected local law, and presented lavish gifts. From Surat, the pattern repeated. Madras, now Chennai, on the southeastern coast. Bombay, a cluster of islands on the western shore, transferred from the Portuguese as part of a royal marriage and then leased to the company. Calcutta, Kolkata, on the eastern side of the subcontinent, where the Hooghly River meets the sea. Each began as a factory in the old sense of the word, a fortified trading compound where factors, or agents, lived and worked. Inside those walls, English clerks counted bales of cotton and silk, weighed pepper and saltpetre, and tried to keep the monsoon damp out of their records. Outside, they moved cautiously through a world dominated by Mughal officials, local princes, merchant guilds, and powerful banking families. The company, for its first decades in India, was a minor player in someone else's empire, but money has a way of seeping into power. Indian textiles, especially fine cottons and silks, became wildly popular in Europe. Calicos and muslins flooded London markets. People who would never see India wrapped themselves in its cloth. The company's ships sailed in irregular circuits, English silver out, Indian goods back, then on to Africa and the Americas. Bit by bit the balance sheet grew. With profit came ambition. The company began hiring more troops, first as guards for its warehouses, then as permanent garrisons. Many of these soldiers were Indian recruits trained in European drill, commanded by British officers. They were called sepoys. Over time, the company's private army swelled from a few hundred to tens of thousands of men. For a long while, this growing force existed in the shadow of Mughal power. The emperors in Delhi and their governors in the provinces still called the shots, but empires age. By the late 1600s and early 1700s, the Mughal Empire was beginning to fray. Succession struggles at the top drained resources. Powerful regional governors, Nayabs and Rajas, started acting more independently. Maratha warriors in the west, Sikh states in the north, and other regional powers pushed back against Mughal control. To people living through it, the decline probably didn't feel like a single dramatic collapse, but a long series of uncertainties. One ruler dies, another is weaker. Taxes rise in some places and fall in others. Armies march. Alliances shift. Old guarantees of protection start to seem less certain. Into these cracks stepped the company. They had money. They had guns. And crucially, they had no intention of going home. Company officials began doing something that, on paper, they were never intended to do, playing politics. They loaned money to cash-strapped princes. They offered military aid to one faction in a succession dispute, on condition that their trading rights were expanded. They negotiated tax exemptions and legal privileges, sometimes with the emperor's blessing, sometimes by quietly pressuring local officials. In Bengal, one of the richest provinces in India, this dance turned deadly. By the mid-1700s, Bengal was a prize beyond imagining. Fertile rivers fed rice fields and cotton farms. Weavers produced some of the finest textiles in the world. Calcutta, the company's base there, was growing into a major port. But the Nawabs of Bengal resented how the English merchants were edging beyond their original permissions, fortifying their settlements and evading customs. In 1756, a young Nawab named Siraj-ud-Dowlah moved against the company. He captured Calcutta, imprisoned many of its defenders, and briefly seemed to have checked the foreign traders. The company, outraged and alarmed, dispatched a relief force under an officer who had already made a name for himself in India, Robert Clive. Clive was not a grand strategist in the modern sense. He was a former clerk who had reinvented himself as a soldier of fortune, ambitious, ruthless, and remarkably willing to gamble. When his army met the Nawabs near the village of Plassey in June 1757, the odds on paper looked lopsided. Siraj's forces outnumbered Clive's by tens of thousands. But numbers are only part of a battle. Clive had done his homework. Through secret negotiations, he persuaded key Bengali commanders to hold back or switch sides mid-battle. He promised them riches and titles if they helped unseat Siraj. When the fighting began, confusion and betrayal spread through the Nawab's camp. What might have been a crushing defeat for the company turned into a swift, decisive victory. Plassey lasted only a few hours. Its consequences lasted centuries. In the aftermath, the company installed a more compliant ruler in Bengal, and, more importantly, secured the right to collect land revenues in large parts of the province. This wasn't just about trade anymore. It meant that a private corporation, headquartered in London, now controlled the tax base of one of India's richest regions. The East India Company had become, almost without anyone intending it in 1600, a state within a state. From this point on, the logic of the enterprise shifted. Trade was still important, but the real money lay in revenue. Company officials in Bengal and eventually other territories didn't merely buy and sell goods. They assessed land, levied taxes, and enforced collection, backed by their private army. They set up courts to adjudicate disputes, often blending English legal ideas with existing Indian practices, always in ways that tended to protect company interests. On the ground, this new order could feel bewildering. Peasants who had once paid taxes to a Nawab's officers now faced company-appointed revenue farmers. Local rulers found themselves reduced to pensioners, maintaining a ceremonial court while real decisions were made in distant offices. traditional systems of patronage and protection were disrupted. Some Indian elites made fortunes by aligning themselves with the new power. Others were sidelined or ruined. The human cost of this experiment in corporate governance showed itself starkly in times of crisis. In 1770, Bengal was struck by a devastating famine, a combination of crop failures, harsh revenue demands, and market speculation led to mass starvation. Contemporary accounts describe corpses lying by the roadside, villages emptied, entire tracts of land falling out of cultivation. Estimates of mortality vary, but many historians think that millions died. The company's response was uneven and, in many places, tragically inadequate. Officials were reluctant to reduce land assessments for fear of angering their superiors in London. Grain continued to be exported even as people starved. Some individuals tried to help, others saw an opportunity for profit. By the time the famine ended, the company's reputation, even in Britain, had been badly damaged, yet the wealth kept flowing. Indian revenues helped bankroll British wars in Europe and North America. Profits from land taxes and monopolies underwrote new campaigns of conquest on the subcontinent itself. The company's armies expanded, drawing more and more Indian soldiers into their ranks. Each new victory against Mysore in the south, the Marathas in the west, the Sikhs in the north, brought more territories under company control. It's here that a new idea began to take shape among some Indian thinkers, the sense that India's wealth was being systematically drained away. In the 19th century, long after Plassey, Indian nationalists would give this a name, the drain theory. Observers like Dadabhai Naoroji argued that under British rule, profits, salaries of British officials, pensions and interest payments were flowing out of India and into Britain without equivalent returns. Even earlier, people could feel the imbalance, even if they didn't use modern economic terms. Taxes collected in rupees were paying for palaces and investments thousands of miles away. To walk through a company-ruled city at the end of the 18th century was to see this tension everywhere. On one street, Indian artisans still weaving fine cloth. On another, European merchants in spacious houses, servants in attendance, ledgers full of calculations about exchange rates and freight costs. Outside the city, villages where farmers worried about the next assessment, the next bad monsoon, the next rumour of rebellion. A joint stock company created to chase pepper and cloves had become an empire in all but name. It had directors, not ministers, shareholders, not citizens. Its flags flew over forts. Its soldiers marched under its own commanders. Its decisions about taxation, justice and war shaped the lives of tens of millions of people who had never seen London, never bought a share, never given their consent. In time, even the British state would grow uneasy with this arrangement. Scandals, bankruptcies and uprisings would force Parliament to step in, to regulate, and eventually to take direct control. But by then, the pattern was set. Corporate power, backed by military force and wrapped in the language of trade and improvement, had shown how far it could go. The East India Company had not just opened markets. It had conquered a subcontinent in all but name, and in doing so it had given Britain something more enduring than spices or textiles, a vast reluctant cornerstone for a global empire. And as Britain's rivals watched this transformation, they understood something chillingly simple. The future of power might lie less in kings and more in companies, less in royal decrees and more in balance sheets. By the time the East India Company was turning from trader to tax collector in Bengal, Britain's imperial story was no longer just about merchants and distant princes. It was about rivals. Other European powers had been building maritime empires for a century before England really found its sea legs. The Portuguese had nailed crucifixes to the coasts of Africa and India. The Spanish had taken huge bites out of the Americas. The Dutch, those merchants of the North Sea, had woven themselves into almost every profitable trade route on the planet. If the company was one laboratory for Britain's rise, then the wars with these rivals were another. They were experiments in a different kind of power: guns, ships, credit, and sheer endurance. The first great test came not in India, but against neighbours just across the water, the Dutch. In the 1600s, the Dutch Republic was by many measures the commercial superpower of Europe. Amsterdam's merchants sat at the centre of a glittering web of trade. Dutch ships carried Baltic grain, African ivory, Asian spices, American sugar. Their East India Company, the VOC, was older, richer, and far more entrenched in Asian trade than its English counterpart. England could not simply out-merchant the Dutch. So it tried something else: outfight them. The Anglo-Dutch wars, fought in the mid-1600s, were brutal, seesawing conflicts that turned the North Sea and the English Channel into killing grounds of oak and iron. Fleets of warships, wooden hulls bristling with cannon, clashed again and again over who would control the carrying trade of Europe. These wars were not just about flags or wounded pride. They were about the right to move goods, to levy customs, to be the middleman of the world. In a sense, they were arguments over who would collect the world's delivery fees. Sometimes the Dutch had the better admirals, sometimes the English. Battles were won or lost in sudden bursts of wind, hidden sandbanks, or misread signals. Whole crews could be wiped out in minutes by a lucky broadside. For the men on deck, it was chaos. For the merchants and ministers back in London and Amsterdam, it was strategy. Over the course of 3 major wars, a pattern emerged. The English state learned to mobilise resources on a scale it had never attempted before. Taxes increased, dockyards expanded, navigation acts tried to lock foreign ships out of England's colonial trade. In this furnace of conflict, the idea of a standing professional Royal Navy took shape, not just a collection of ships, but an institution. The outcome was not a simple knockout. The Dutch did not vanish from the seas. Their merchants remained formidable. But the balance shifted. England gained important colonial and commercial footholds, including the small, easily overlooked Dutch colony of New Amsterdam, which the English renamed New York. Ironically, just as England was learning to compete with Dutch merchants, they'd invited a Dutch prince to sit on its throne. In 1688, a quiet revolution unfolded in Britain. Parliament, worried about the Catholic leanings and absolutist tendencies of King James II, reached out to his Protestant son-in-law, William of Orange, stadtholder of the Dutch Republic. William crossed the Channel with an army, James fled, and Parliament declared that the throne was vacant. William and his English wife Mary were invited to rule jointly. This glorious revolution was bloodless only from a distance. In Ireland and Scotland it sparked real wars, but in England it rearranged power in a way that would shape the empire's future. A Dutch ruler now sat on the English throne. The old enemies at sea were, at least for a time, united by a common cause: the defence of Protestant Europe against Catholic France. The real rival for the next century would not be the Dutch. It would be the kingdom ruled by Louis XIV and his successors, the great restless power just across the Channel. France was larger than England, more populous, with fertile lands and a sophisticated state apparatus. French culture set the tone for Europe. French armies dominated battlefields from the Rhine to the Pyrenees. French colonies stretched from the Caribbean to the Mississippi Valley to Canada and beyond. If the 1600s had been, in part, a contest with the Dutch over trade, the 1700s would be defined by a long, grinding struggle with France over something bigger. Which language, which legal systems, which financial networks would shape the emerging Atlantic and global order? The War of the Spanish Succession at the beginning of the 18th century was one early round. When the King of Spain died without a direct heir, Europe's powers scrambled to decide who would inherit a vast empire that stretched across the Americas and into Asia. France backed one candidate. Britain and its allies backed another. Armies marched. Fleets fought. The war ended in 1713 with a series of treaties that clipped French ambitions and handed Britain valuable prizes, including control of Gibraltar and the Asiento, the contract to supply enslaved Africans to Spanish America. These gains were important, but they were just the prelude. The decisive confrontation came a few decades later, in a conflict that many historians think of as the first truly global war, the 7 Years' War, fought from 1756 to 1763. It started, in a way that now seems almost darkly ironic, in the forests of North America. In the Ohio Valley, British colonists and French officers jostled over forts and alliances with indigenous nations. A young Virginian officer named George Washington stumbled into a skirmish that helped ignite a much larger blaze. Within a few years, Britain and France were fighting not just in the Americas, but in Europe, the Caribbean, West Africa, and India. Everywhere the two powers met, local struggles and long-running rivalries were pulled into the gravitational field of the larger war. In North America, British redcoats and colonial militias laid siege to French strongholds like Louisbourg and Quebec. In the Caribbean, hurricanes and disease were as deadly as cannon, but Sugar Islands changed hands in bloody assaults. Along the West African coast, forts that anchored the slave trade were bombarded and captured. In India, the conflict overlapped with the East India Company's battles against French trading interests and their Indian allies. Company troops and French forces fought sieges and pitched battles as local rulers weighed which European power would serve their interests better, or at least do less damage. On paper, Britain seemed to be the weaker power. France had a larger army, more people, and a long tradition of continental warfare. But Britain had something France struggled to match, the ability to borrow. Since the Glorious Revolution, the English, and then British, state had developed a financial architecture that turned private wealth into public firepower. Parliament-backed borrowing created a credible national debt, underwritten by taxes and managed by a new institution founded in 1694, the Bank of England. Investors who might once have hesitated to lend to a king, who could default, die, or simply decide not to pay, were more willing to lend to a state where Parliament held the purse strings. Government bonds became a kind of financial backbone. The Bank of England coordinated payments, stabilised credit, and turned scattered savings into a war chest. This meant that Britain could sustain long wars without collapsing under their cost. It could build and maintain a powerful Royal Navy, subsidise allies on the continent, outfit expeditionary forces, and replace lost ships and guns faster than its enemies. During the 7 Years' War, this combination, naval power and financial muscle, proved devastating. The Royal Navy didn't win every engagement, but it choked French trade, intercepted convoys, and gradually pried apart the connections between France and its overseas colonies. British fleets appeared off coasts from Quebec to Bengal, delivering troops, supplies, and blockades. French commerce dwindled, insurance rates soared, colonial garrisons went hungry. On land, British commanders like James Wolfe in North America and Robert Clive in India, drawing on local allies, colonial militias and company sepoys, won key battles that tipped regional balances of power. When Wolfe's forces scaled the cliffs outside Quebec in 1759 and defeated the French on the Plains of Abraham, it was not just a dramatic moment in one campaign. It signalled the near end of French Canada. By the time the war ended in 1763, France was exhausted. So was Britain. But Britain had won more. The Treaty of Paris redrew the map in ways that would echo for centuries. France ceded Canada to Britain, along with its claims east of the Mississippi River. Spain, drawn into the war on the French side, handed over Florida. In India, while France retained a few trading posts, its political influence was shattered. The East India Company emerged as the dominant European power on the subcontinent. In just a few decades, Britain's overseas empire had swollen. What had been a patchwork of colonies and trading posts became something closer to a global system. From Canadian forests to Bengal rice fields, from Caribbean sugar plantations to forts on the African coast, British authority, sometimes direct, sometimes through companies or allied rulers, stretched along the world's trade routes. Yet this new scale came with new strains. The wars had been paid for with borrowed money. The national debt towered. Servicing it required taxes, and taxes required justification. Philosophers and pamphleteers in Britain began to talk more about representation, contracts, and the rights of subjects. Across the Atlantic, colonists heard these arguments and drew their own conclusions. For the moment, though, in 1763, it must have seemed to many in London as though the great rivalries had been settled in Britain's favour. The Dutch had been edged aside. The French had been checked. The Royal Navy commanded the seas. The Bank of England and the national debt had turned financial trust into cannon and canvas. Britain stood at what looked like the pinnacle of victory, its empire suddenly vast and glittering. It was at this height that the first deep cracks began to form. The crack widened first in a place many in London still thought of as a provincial fringe, Britain's North American colonies. These were not minor outposts. By the 1760s, the 13 colonies along the Atlantic seaboard were among Britain's richest possessions. Their ports, Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Charleston, were plugged into the veins of Atlantic commerce. Timber, fish, furs, grain, tobacco, rice, indigo, and increasingly, ideas flowed through them. Many colonists saw themselves as loyal Britons. They read the same newspapers, quoted the same poets, drank the same tea. They toasted the king in taverns and volunteered in militias during the wars with France. When French flags came down over Quebec, many in the colonies celebrated, believing they had helped secure a British future for North America. But victory has a way of exposing hidden fractures. Britain had won the 7 Years' War, but it had paid dearly. The national debt had ballooned. Interest payments gnawed at the treasury. Politicians in London looked at the prosperous colonies across the Atlantic and asked a question that, to them, seemed perfectly reasonable. Shouldn't they help pay? The logic was simple enough on paper. The colonies had benefited from British protection. British troops, expensive to recruit, transport and supply, had defended them from French armies and their indigenous allies. Maintaining garrisons on the frontier would continue to cost money. Taxes and duties, the ministers argued, were a fair price for security. On the other side of the ocean, the same question sounded very different. Colonial assemblies had long been used to managing their own taxation. Local elites, merchants, planters, lawyers saw fiscal control as part of their British birthright. They followed debates in Parliament closely. They read John Locke, Montesquieu, and other Enlightenment thinkers who talked about consent, natural rights, and the dangers of unchecked power. So when the British government began to impose new taxes and regulations, the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, the Townshend duties, many colonists did not just complain about the cost. They questioned the principle. If they were Englishmen, where was their representation? If Parliament could tax them without their consent, what else could it do? Was this still the balanced constitution they'd been taught to admire, or something slipping toward arbitrary rule? Taxation without representation was not just a catchy slogan on a protest banner. It was the surface foam of a deeper current, a debate about what the empire actually was, a family of self-governing communities under a shared crown, or a hierarchy with Westminster at the top and distant colonies expected to obey. Crises followed one another in a quickening rhythm. The Boston Massacre, the Tea Act and the Boston Tea Party, the coercive acts. Each step on both sides made sense to the people taking it. British ministers thought they were asserting necessary authority over unruly subjects. Colonial leaders thought they were defending ancient rights against encroaching tyranny. In 1775, the argument turned into war. What became the American Revolution was at first a civil war within a British world. Neighbours chose sides, families split. Loyalists and patriots clashed in newspapers, in courtrooms, on battlefields. Redcoats and colonial militias exchanged fire at Lexington and Concord, at Bunker Hill, along muddy roads and frozen rivers. From London, this was supposed to be a punitive expedition, a sharp lesson. Britain still possessed the world's most formidable navy, a professional army and global resources. The colonies seemed on paper outmatched. But wars are not fought on paper. Distance mattered. Every musket, every uniform, every barrel of gunpowder Britain sent had to cross the Atlantic, through storms and past privateers. The colonies, by contrast, were fighting in their own backyards. Ideas mattered. Many colonists had convinced themselves that they were defending liberty itself. Pamphlets, sermons and speeches wrapped their struggle in universal language. Rights of man, consent of the governed. When the Continental Congress issued the Declaration of Independence in 1776, it was not just a list of grievances. It was a claim that all governments rested on the will of the people, an idea that, once spoken, was hard to contain. Allies mattered most of all. For years, France had watched Britain's rise with a mixture of resentment and calculation. The loss of Canada had been a profound humiliation. Now, French ministers saw an opportunity wrapped in colonial rhetoric. By supporting the American rebels, France could bleed its old enemy without facing the full cost of a direct invasion of Britain. Money, weapons and volunteers began to flow across the Atlantic. Later, Spanish and Dutch support joined the mix. What had begun as a British imperial quarrel turned into another global war. French intervention tipped the scales. It was French fleets and French troops that helped trap a British army at Yorktown in 1781. When that army surrendered, the political will in Britain to keep fighting evaporated. 2 years later, in 1783, the Treaty of Paris recognized the independence of the United States. For the first time, Britain had not just lost a colony. It had lost an entire continental empire in the making. In London, this was a shock. How had the state that had humbled France, mastered credit and commanded the seas, allowed its richest mainland colonies to slip away? Pamphleteers blamed bad generals, foolish ministers, corrupt interests, or radical philosophers. There were inquiries and recriminations, memorials and laments. It would have been reasonable to imagine that this was the beginning of imperial decline, a broken empire chastened and retrenching. But that's not what happened. Instead, the loss of America acted more like a violent redirection of pressure. The energy, capital, and ambition that had once poured west across the Atlantic turned more decisively east and south. India, where the East India Company had already become a territorial power, loomed larger than ever. The logic of empire shifted. If settler colonies like those in North America could become rebellious republics, perhaps commercial and military control without large British populations would be safer. At the same time, the map itself was changing. In the 1770s, as trouble was brewing in Boston and Philadelphia, a navigator named James Cook was tracing coastlines thousands of miles away. On voyages across the Pacific, Cook charted New Zealand, mapped the eastern shore of a vast southern continent, and claimed it for Britain as New South Wales. These were not just lines on charts, they were potential futures. After the American War, those futures became more attractive. Britain had used its North American colonies as destinations for convicts and the poor. With that outlet gone, the government looked for alternatives. In 1788, the first fleet sailed into a bay on the east coast of Australia. There, on land recently mapped by Cook and long inhabited by Aboriginal peoples, the British founded a penal colony. It began as a desperate improvisation, a remote prison on the far side of the world. But prisons have a way of turning into settlements, and settlements into colonies. Over time, Australia and later New Zealand would become new kinds of British worlds, echoes, in some ways, of the lost American colonies, but with their own brutal histories of dispossession and expansion. While sails carried convicts and settlers into the Pacific, another current of change was building closer to home. By the early 19th century, the Atlantic slave trade, once a pillar of Britain's colonial wealth, was under attack, not just from enslaved people themselves, who resisted in ways large and small, but from a growing abolitionist movement in Britain. Preachers thundered against the trade from pulpits. Former enslaved people wrote memoirs and spoke at meetings. Middle-class families signed petitions, boycotted sugar, and joined societies dedicated to ending what they called a national sin. Moral conviction played a real role, so did changing economics and strategy. Plantation systems in some islands were becoming less profitable relative to new industrial opportunities. War with revolutionary and Napoleonic France made control of the seas and of public opinion more important than individual sugar fortunes. Ending the trade could hurt rivals still dependent on it and burnish Britain's image as a moral leader. In 1807, after years of agitation, Parliament passed the Act for the abolition of the slave trade, making it illegal for British ships to traffic enslaved Africans. In 1833, slavery itself was abolished across most of the British Empire, though with compensation for slave owners and very little for the enslaved. These were not pure triumphs of conscience. Freed people often found themselves tethered to new forms of coerced labour. Yet something real had shifted. A state that had once enriched itself by selling human beings now proclaimed, at least in law, that this commerce was intolerable. Crucially, Britain did not just change its own rules. It used its greatest imperial asset, the Royal Navy, to try to impose those rules on others. British squadrons began patrolling the Atlantic and Indian Oceans, stopping and searching ships suspected of carrying enslaved people. Treaties were signed with other powers. Slave ships were seized. Captives were, in some cases, resettled in places like Sierra Leone. To some, this looked like humanitarianism backed by cannon. To others, it looked like a new kind of policing power over the seas. By claiming the right to board foreign vessels in the name of abolition, Britain also reinforced its practical control of maritime routes. Meanwhile, the end of slavery did not mean the end of exploitation. It often meant its reconfiguration. Indentured labourers from India and China were shipped to plantations in the Caribbean, Mauritius, Fiji and elsewhere. Wages replaced chains, but contracts were often opaque, conditions harsh, and movement tightly controlled. In India, tax systems, land policies, and trade rules funneled wealth to Britain. In Southeast Asia and China, opium, textiles and treaties carved out profitable markets. The same navy that hunted slavers protected these new flows of goods. The same financial institutions that had once underwritten slaving voyages now financed railways, plantations and mines. Empire, like a river forced through new channels, found other ways to move. By the mid-19th century, Britain had lost the 13 colonies that had once seemed central to its imperial project. In their place, it had stitched together something even larger, a web of territories, bases, and economic dependencies that reached deeply into Asia, Africa, and the Pacific. The humiliation of losing America had not ended the British Empire. It had transformed it, pushing it toward a world where steam, coal, and factories would matter as much as sugar and tobacco, where treaties and trade statistics could be as powerful as muskets. The next phase of that transformation would not be driven only by ships and soldiers, but by engines, looms, and smokestacks. The engines began quietly, in workshops that hardly anyone outside Britain had heard of. In the late 18th century, there was no guarantee that this storm of innovation would start on a cold, damp island off the coast of Europe. China had older cities and refined crafts. India had rich textile traditions and sophisticated markets. Parts of continental Europe had skilled artisans and wealthy patrons. Yet something about Britain in this moment was different. Start with the ground itself. Beneath the fields and hedgerows of England, Scotland and Wales lay thick seams of coal, close enough to the surface to be worth digging. For centuries people had burned wood for heat and charcoal for furnaces. Forests could be cut down. Coal, in many places in Britain, seemed almost inexhaustible, but coal had a problem. Mines flooded. The deeper you dug, the more water seeped in, until pumps driven by horses or water wheels could not keep up. That might have been the end of it, a geological limit to growth, if not for another ingredient Britain had in unusual abundance: tinkerers, blacksmiths, millwrights, instrument makers, mechanics. People who liked to take things apart and put them back together slightly improved. They lived in a culture where patent law protected inventions, where societies and coffee houses welcomed debate, and where a growing print industry spread new ideas quickly. An improved valve designed in one town could be read about and copied in another within months. Into this world stepped people like Thomas Newcomen and James Watt, who did not see flooded mines as a curse but as an engineering problem. The early steam engines they built were clumsy, massive and temperamental. They hissed and groaned and leaked. But they worked well enough to pump water out of coal mines. That meant more coal. More coal meant more fuel for more engines. A feedback loop had begun. Coal and steam were only part of the story. Britain also had capital. For over a century, its merchants and financiers had been refining the arts of credit, insurance, and joint stock investment. Profits from Atlantic trade, from plantations, from the East India Company's ventures in Asia, had piled up in banks in London, Bristol, Liverpool. This money was looking for new uses. Factory owners could borrow to build mills. Entrepreneurs could raise funds to lay canals that sliced through the countryside, connecting coalfields to cities and ports. Investors were willing to risk money on ironworks, spinning machines, and experimental engines because they lived in a state that, compared to many rivals, offered relatively stable law, private property protections, and a government that did not habitually seize private fortunes. Then there were the colonies. By the late 1700s, Britain commanded access to an enormous, if uneven, imperial network. Sugar from the Caribbean, cotton from the Americas, and increasingly from India, dyes from Asia, timber and whale oil from distant seas. These were not just luxuries, they were raw materials. In Lancashire and Yorkshire, entrepreneurs began to realize that if they could spin and weave cotton mechanically, they could turn mountains of cheap fibre into rivers of cloth. Colonies, coerced and controlled, would supply the raw stuff. Factories at home would transform it into finished goods. Other colonial and foreign markets would then be pressured or forced to buy those goods, coal underfoot, capital in the banks, colonies in the ledger books, canals threading the island together, and a culture that rewarded people who could make machines a little faster, a little cheaper, a little more efficient. None of these things alone guaranteed an industrial revolution. Together in Britain they made one overwhelmingly likely. The result was a transformation so fast that people living through it struggled to find words to describe it. Walk, in your mind, into an early 19th century cotton mill. The air is thick with lint. Rows of machines stretch farther than a handloom weaver in a village cottage could have imagined. Spinning mules and power looms clatter and whir, turning raw cotton into thread and cloth with a speed no human hands can match. Instead of a few artisans working at their own pace, there are hundreds of workers, men, women, children, bound to the rhythm of the machine. Outside, chimneys punch into the sky, exhaling coal smoke. Ironworks roar in nearby valleys, pouring molten metal into moulds that will become rails, engines, ships, guns. Along new canals and soon, along new railway lines, barges and trains carry these products to ports. Steam, which began as a way of pumping water out of mines, becomes a general-purpose power source. Steam engines drive factory machines, power rolling mills, and when mounted on wheels and placed on iron tracks, move people and goods faster than any horse. Railways, once an experiment between a mine and harbour, spread rapidly. By the 1840s, steel lines knit Britain together in a web of movement. A journey that might once have taken days by coach could now be done in hours by train. Perishable goods could be carried before they spoiled. Newspapers could arrive the same day they were printed, allowing markets and opinions to react more quickly. These same technologies, steam engines, iron ships, precision tools, telegraphs, gave Britain a technological edge over almost every other state. Factories that could turn out muskets, cannons, uniforms and ships' fittings at scale made it easier to equip armies and navies. Steam-driven ships, no longer dependent on wind, could move against currents and up rivers, projecting power inland. Telegraph cables allowed news of wars, negotiations and uprisings to travel in minutes instead of weeks. Britain's industrialization and its empire did not develop in isolation from each other. They were two halves of a single system. Raw materials flowed in, manufactured goods flowed out. Cotton is the starkest example. Before British machines remade the trade, India had been one of the world's great textile regions. For centuries, Indian handloom weavers produced fine muslins, calicos, and silks that merchants from Europe, the Middle East and Asia prized. These were high-skill crafts, embedded in local economies and cultures. When British industrial cloth began to pour out of the mills of Lancashire, the logic of power shifted. Using its control over Indian ports, tariffs and internal trade, Britain tilted the playing field. Indian cotton was increasingly bought as cheap raw fibre, often at prices shaped by imperial policy. That cotton was shipped to Britain, spun and woven in mechanized mills, then sent back as finished cloth, sold in India at prices village weavers could not possibly match. Taxes, trade rules, and sometimes outright bans on certain Indian manufactures compounded the pressure. Weavers who had once sold fine cloth across the region found their markets flooded with factory-made imports. Stories from the time speak of ruined families, abandoned looms, skills that had taken generations to perfect, suddenly made economically worthless. Across vast swathes of the subcontinent and old balance inverted, India, long an exporter of textiles, became a captive market for British cloth and a supplier of the raw cotton that fed British machines. Empire fed industry. Industry in turn strengthened empire. Iron rails and steam locomotives did not stop at Britain's shores. They followed the flag. In India, in parts of Africa, in colonies and protectorates elsewhere, British engineers and financiers laid down railway tracks that, on paper, promised progress. They linked interior regions to ports. They drove lines through mountains and across rivers. They built telegraph networks that paralleled the rails, allowing officials to send orders and traders to send prices almost instantaneously. But the logic behind many of these projects was not to knit colonized societies together for their own sake. It was to extract. Railways ran from plantation belts, mining districts, and grain-growing plains to harbours where steamships waited. Ports were dredged and expanded to handle increasing volumes of exports. Telegraph offices sprouted in administrative centres, tying local officials to provincial capitals and those capitals to London. To a casual observer, this might have looked like pure modernisation: steel bridges, grand stations, iron masts. To those on the receiving end, it often felt like incorporation into a machine designed elsewhere. Infrastructure became a tool of control as much as of transport. Troops could be rushed to suppress uprisings. Crops could be moved out of drought-stricken regions to meet export contracts, even when local people were going hungry. Decisions made in distant boardrooms echoed along the rails and cables, shaping lives thousands of miles away. All of this unfolded within a particular mental world, the Victorian belief in progress. Many Britons in the 19th century convinced themselves that the new age of steam and steel was not just more powerful, but more moral. They read newspapers that celebrated railway openings as triumphs of civilization. They saw missionary work, schooling, and legal reforms in the colonies as evidence that Britain was bringing light to what they called backward societies. Industrialization at home was framed as proof of national vigour, a sign that providence or history favoured the island kingdom. When they looked at maps coloured in imperial red, at factories humming with exported cotton cloth, at trains racing across colonised landscapes, many Victorians did not simply see wealth. They saw a kind of justification. If Britain was richest, if its engines were strongest, if its ships and cables encircled the globe, then perhaps this dominance was deserved. Perhaps it was a natural order. This was a dangerous idea. It allowed the costs of empire, the famines intensified by export policies, the shattered artisan economies, the forced labour behind voluntary contracts, to be set aside as unfortunate side effects of an otherwise righteous mission. Industrialisation had given Britain unprecedented tools. The Victorian mindset helped ensure those tools were used to deepen imperial reach, under the comforting story that it was all in the end for the world's own good. Behind the banners of progress and civilization, the engine of empire was roaring. And in the decades to come, that engine would drive Britain and its rivals into a new, more intense competition over the remaining unclaimed spaces of the map. By the late 19th century, that map of the world, with its spreading patches of imperial red, had become more than a picture. It was an obsession. There were fewer and fewer blank spaces left to colour in. Europe was already divided. The Americas had thrown off most colonial rule. Asia was a patchwork of empires and fragile independent states. That left one continent which, in the minds of European politicians and businessmen, looked temptingly open: Africa. Of course, it was not open at all. It was home to powerful kingdoms, trading cities, pastoral confederations, long-established routes of commerce and pilgrimage. People there knew their lands well, farmed them, fought over them, governed them. But on European maps, much of the interior still appeared as vague shapes and pale shading, with rivers half-guessed and borders left blank. To industrial powers hungry for raw materials, markets, and prestige, those pale spaces looked like invitations. So they did something extraordinary. They held a meeting. In 1884, representatives of European powers gathered in Berlin. It was winter. Coal fires burned in the stoves. Outside, the city was wrapped in cold fog. Inside, around polished tables, diplomats unfolded maps of Africa. They brought out rulers and pencils. Over the next months, at what we now call the Berlin Conference, they negotiated rules for how European states would claim and occupy African territory. They argued about rivers and coastlines, spheres of influence and free trade zones, but shared one basic assumption, that they, not the people living on the continent, had the right to decide how it would be divided. It is hard to overstate the abstraction of what they did. Lines were drawn across regions the participants had never seen. Borders sliced through existing kingdoms, cut across grazing lands, split ethnic groups and trade networks. An African ruler might find, years later, that his domain had been placed partly in French territory, partly in British, partly in some vaguely defined zone belonging to another power. On paper, it looked neat. On the ground, it meant that European flags, forts and administrative posts would follow those pencil strokes, often enforced by rifles and machine guns that industrialization had made cheap and deadly. Britain, by this point, could not simply watch from the sidelines. It already had important footholds, at the Cape of Good Hope in the south, in Sierra Leone and the Gold Coast in the west, in Egypt and along the route to India in the northeast. Informal influence and trade had long linked British merchants to coastal societies and some interior kingdoms, but the Berlin rules threatened to hem these scattered positions in. If Britain did not move inland, others would. Into this moment stepped a man who thought in straight lines, Cecil Rhodes. Rhodes arrived in southern Africa as a sickly teenager and, within a few decades, became one of the most powerful figures in the region. He believed fervently that the English-speaking world had a destiny to rule. He made a fortune in diamonds, especially after the Kimberley fields were consolidated into a giant company, De Beers. Later, gold from the Witwatersrand added another glittering stream of wealth. For Rhodes, these were not just profitable commodities. They were fuel for a larger dream. He imagined a continuous band of British-controlled territory, stretching from the Cape in the south to Cairo in the north, a red corridor across the continent stitched together by telegraph lines, and eventually by a railway, Cape to Cairo. It sounded almost poetic. In practice, it meant treaties signed under pressure, land seized, local rulers sidelined or removed. Charter companies, backed by London investors and the British government, pushed into what are now Zimbabwe and Zambia. They planted the Union Jack over territories renamed Rhodesia in his honour. But there were other settlers in southern Africa with their own ambitions. The Boers, descendants of Dutch, German and French colonists, had trekked inland in the 1800s to establish independent republics like the Orange Free State and the South African Republic, Transvaal. When vast gold deposits were found in Boer territory, tensions between these republics and the expanding British presence sharpened. What followed is known as the Boer Wars. The first, in the early 1880s, was short and humiliating for Britain. The second, beginning in 1899, was far longer and far more brutal. British forces expected a quick victory. Instead, they faced determined guerrilla resistance from Boer commandos who knew the terrain intimately. In response, British commanders adopted harsh tactics, scorched earth campaigns that burned farms, slaughtered livestock, destroyed crops. To cut Boer fighters off from support, they herded civilians, mainly women and children, into what were called concentration camps. Conditions in many of these camps were appalling. Overcrowding, poor sanitation, inadequate food and medical care led to the deaths of tens of thousands, including large numbers of children. Black Africans, also swept into their own camps or forced into labour as the war disrupted their lives, suffered greatly as well. The conflict ended with British victory and the formal incorporation of the Boer republics into a wider South African framework under British influence. On the map, the empire had gained another thick red block. In human terms, the cost was deep trauma, bitterness, and patterns of dispossession that would echo into the 20th century. Far to the north, another obsession was shaping British policy: Egypt and a narrow strip of water cut through the desert, the Suez Canal. Completed in 1869, Suez linked the Mediterranean to the Red Sea. For a maritime empire whose crown jewel lay in India, this was revolutionary. Before Suez, Ships from Britain to Bombay and Calcutta had to round the Cape of Good Hope, adding weeks to the journey. After Suez, they could pass through this man-made corridor and shave thousands of miles off the route. Time, in global trade, is power. British investors had already bought a large share of the Canal Company. When financial troubles and political upheaval shook Egypt in the 1870s and 1880s, British troops moved in, ostensibly to restore order and protect European interests. Egypt remained, on paper, part of the Ottoman Empire. In reality, it fell under British control. From then on, safeguarding Suez became a strategic fixation. Protecting the canal meant influence, or direct control, over Egypt and nearby territories. It meant garrisons, naval patrols, and diplomatic maneuvers stretching from the Mediterranean through the Red Sea and into the Indian Ocean. In British thinking, the route to India had to remain open at almost any cost. Everywhere that phrase, "at almost any cost," hid what was happening on the ground. The scramble for Africa was not just flags and treaties. It was forced labour on plantations and in mines, men compelled to leave their villages for months or years. It was porterage, people made to carry heavy loads for colonial expeditions, often across deadly terrain. It was taxes payable only in cash, which pushed farmers into wage labour or compelled them to grow export crops instead of food. In some regions, resistance met with massacres. Villages burned as examples. Collective punishments imposed for attacks on roads or railways. Cultural and religious practices were sometimes suppressed in the name of civilizing, while mission schools and colonial courts tried to reshape societies according to European norms. Even where outright violence was less visible, the transformations ran deep. Land that had been held collectively might be surveyed, registered, and declared crown land or waste, open to concession companies. Pastoral routes were hemmed in by new borders. Local industries, from ironworking to weaving, found themselves competing with imported British goods. People adapted as best they could. Some entered colonial administrations as clerks and interpreters. Some used mission education to become lawyers, teachers, or journalists, developing new forms of political thought. Others fought, openly or covertly. Many simply tried to survive within a system that had been imposed without their consent. By the early 20th century, the cumulative result of these expansions was staggering. From Canada to the Caribbean, from India to Australia and New Zealand, from chunks of China's coastline to a swathe of Africa stretching from the Nile Valley to the southern tip of the continent, the British Empire covered roughly a quarter of the world's land surface and claimed authority over hundreds of millions of people. It was around 1920 that observers began to repeat, with particular pride, a line that had circulated in earlier centuries, that the sun never set on the British Empire. It was literally true in a geographic sense. At any given moment, the sun was shining on some piece of territory under British rule. Dawn might be touching the Pacific Islands as evening settled over West Africa, while noonday sun blazed over India and the Middle East. For many Britons, especially those reading newspaper at home, this was a source of comfort and identity. It suggested permanence, a world-spanning order in which British institutions, language and symbols seemed woven into the fabric of the globe. Life inside that empire, however, was anything but uniform. Imagine for a moment an ordinary British soldier on the northwest frontier of India, or in a dusty garrison town in East Africa. His days were filled with drills, boredom, harsh climates, and occasional bursts of fear. He was part of the apparatus of empire, but he was also often poor, with limited prospects at home, sent abroad by economic necessity or a search for adventure that quickly dulled into routine. In nearby offices, colonial administrators wrestled with reports and regulations. Some were idealists convinced they were bringing roads, schools and sanitation. Others were careerists counting the years to a pension. Their power could be vast in local terms, yet they were also bound by instructions from distant superiors and the demands of investors and ministries in London. Missionaries moved through these same landscapes with Bibles and lesson books. Some learned local languages deeply, defended communities against abuses, or recorded histories and folklore. Others attacked existing religions as superstition and saw their task as replacing as much as they could of what they found. And then there were the colonized millions, without whom none of this would have functioned. Farmers coaxing crops from soils whose prices were set in markets they would never see. Dock workers loading bales of cotton, sacks of cocoa, or crates of tea onto ships. Clerks translating orders, tracking taxes, balancing ledgers. Women sustaining families as men left for labour contracts or military service. Children navigating new school systems that taught them to recite imperial histories, while their own ancestral stories were sidelined or condemned. Their experiences were varied, contradictory, layered. Some found paths to influence within the imperial framework. Some suffered dispossession and hunger. Many lived lives that mixed old and new in ways no official report could fully capture, wearing factory-made cloth while observing ancestral festivals, reading newspapers that criticized colonial rule while working in colonial offices, dreaming of futures in which they might appropriate the tools of empire for their own liberation. At the empire's zenith then, there was a blend of confidence and fragility. On the surface, the system looked solid. Rails and cables, flags and forts, laws and ledgers. Underneath, pressures were building, economic, social and political. People across the empire were beginning to ask sharper questions about who benefited from this global arrangement and at what cost. The sun might not set on the British Empire, but shadows were lengthening. And in the coming decades, world events would test whether this sprawling structure could withstand storms unlike any it had faced before. By the early 20th century, that seemingly solid imperial structure was about to be shaken by forces far bigger than any colonial rebellion or diplomatic crisis. Those forces came in the form of world wars. They began, ironically, in Europe, the very continent that had spent decades carving up the rest of the globe. In 1914, a series of alliances, fears and miscalculations turned an assassination in the Balkans into a continent-wide conflict. Britain entered what would be called the Great War. It looked, at first, like a European quarrel. But Britain no longer existed as just an island state. It was the centre of a web. When London went to war, so did much of the empire. From India, hundreds of thousands of soldiers and labourers were recruited. Sikh, Muslim and Hindu regiments fought on the Western Front, in Mesopotamia, in East Africa. Men from Punjab found themselves in the cold mud of Flanders, hearing artillery shells and languages they had never imagined. West African soldiers marched through thick bush against German colonial forces. Caribbean volunteers crossed the Atlantic to serve in labour battalions and naval crews. Australians and New Zealanders sailed vast distances to Gallipoli in the Middle East. The empire became a reservoir of manpower and material, grain from the prairies, cotton from Egypt and India, rubber from Malaya, minerals from Africa, all flowed into the war machine. Colonial ports bustled with troop transports and hospital ships. In villages far from Europe, families listened for news of sons and brothers who had gone to fight for a king they had never seen. The war demanded more than obedience. It required trust. British leaders spoke of shared sacrifice, of defending civilization and democracy. Many in the colonies believed, or wanted to believe, that loyalty would be remembered, that participation in this immense struggle would earn them greater rights, more say in their own governance, perhaps a path to equality within a reformed imperial system. The experience of fighting together, bleeding together, changed perceptions on all sides. Indian troops saw Europeans up close in moments of fear, confusion and weakness. African soldiers watched German and British officers surrender, argue, break down. The idea of European invincibility, already fraying, tore further. In turn, British commanders relied heavily on colonial forces, even as racial hierarchies and prejudices remained deeply embedded. When the guns finally fell silent in 1918, the British Empire stood on the winning side, yet victory hid fractures. Economically, the war had been enormously expensive. Britain emerged heavily indebted, particularly to the United States. Socially and politically, expectations among colonial populations had shifted. Men who had carried rifles and endured gas attacks were no longer inclined to accept that their political role should be limited to paying taxes and following orders. In India, the gap between wartime promises and post-war realities widened into a chasm very quickly. Hopes for significant constitutional reform were met instead with cautious half measures and new repressive laws. In 1919, in the city of Amritsar, those tensions exploded into one of the most infamous episodes of British rule, the Jallianwala Bagh massacre. On a warm April day, thousands of people gathered in an enclosed garden, Jallianwala Bagh, for a peaceful meeting, despite a ban on public assemblies that many didn't fully understand. General Reginald Dyer marched in with troops, blocked the main exit, and without warning ordered his men to fire into the dense crowd. They fired until their ammunition was nearly exhausted. Hundreds were killed, perhaps more. Exact numbers are still debated. Many more were wounded. Panic, screams, bodies piled at the narrow exits. The horror rippled across India, carried by rumour, letters, newspapers. For countless Indians who had once believed in the possibility of a benevolent empire, Jallianwala Bagh was a turning point. Trust shattered. In this atmosphere, the quiet, stubborn figure of Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi began to move to the centre of Indian politics. Trained as a lawyer, shaped by earlier experiences in South Africa, Gandhi developed a program of non-violent resistance, satyagraha, that sought to confront British rule not with guns, but with mass refusal, boycotts, marches, civil disobedience. Millions responded: peasants, urban workers, students, merchants, women and men from varied religious and caste backgrounds joined protests that spread like slow-burning fire through the 1920s and 1930s. In prisons and in ashrams, in salt marches to the sea and in spinning wheel campaigns against imported cloth, the idea that India could and should govern itself took on a new, disciplined moral force. Nor was India the only pressure point. Closer to home, another long-standing question burst into the open. Ireland. For centuries, Ireland had been conquered, colonised, and integrated into the United Kingdom. Resentments over land, religion and political representation simmered constantly. After the First World War, those embers flared. The Irish War of Independence, fought by guerrilla forces against British troops and auxiliaries, led to a treaty in 1921 that created the Irish Free State in most of the island, while partition left Northern Ireland within the UK. It was a profound moment. A land long considered an integral part of the British realm had, in large measure, broken away. For nationalists across the empire, from Cairo to Calcutta, it was a suggestive precedent. If Ireland could leave, perhaps others could too. Throughout the interwar years, Britain tried to hold together a changing imperial order. Some dominions, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, moved toward greater autonomy, tied to Britain by allegiance to the crown but increasingly self-governing. Meanwhile, in colonies without large white settler populations, demands for reforms grew louder. At times, concessions were offered. At others, repression returned. And then, in 1939, another global war began. This time, the stakes were even higher. Nazi Germany's rise, the fall of France, the looming threat to Britain itself, these made the Second World War feel from London like an existential struggle. Once more, the Empire was called upon. Indian soldiers fought in North Africa, the Middle East, Italy and Southeast Asia. African regiments served in campaigns from Abyssinia to Burma. Caribbean seamen crewed merchant ships in the dangerous Atlantic. Troops from Australia and New Zealand again travelled vast distances to battlefields far from home. In speeches, Winston Churchill invoked the Empire's support as evidence of unity and resolve. He spoke of the British family of nations, of a common cause against tyranny. But beneath the rhetoric, something different was happening. The war was hollowing out Britain's resources. Keeping ships at sea, planes in the air and armies in the field required staggering expenditures. To pay for American weapons and supplies under programs like Lend-Lease, Britain sold off overseas assets and accepted a mounting pile of debt. Gold reserves drained away. Factories and docks at home were bombed. Rationing became a way of life. Britain's finest hour was also financially its breaking point. At the same time, the ideological ground was shifting. In 1941, Churchill met with US President Franklin D. Roosevelt off the coast of Newfoundland. From their discussions emerged a document called the Atlantic Charter. It was not a formal treaty, more a statement of principles. No territorial aggrandizement, respect for people's right to choose their own form of government, freer trade, improved social welfare. These ideas were aimed at a post-Nazi world, but they had awkward implications for an empire built on ruling others without their consent. Roosevelt, mindful of America's own anti-colonial origins and facing domestic opinion wary of supporting old empires, quietly and sometimes not so quietly pressed Britain toward decolonization. Loans and support came with subtle expectations. American officials asked pointed questions. If the war was being fought for freedom, what did that mean for India, for Burma, for African colonies? The contradiction between anti-fascist rhetoric and imperial reality became increasingly hard to ignore. And then another shock hit the psychological foundations of empire. In early 1942, Japanese forces swept through Southeast Asia with astonishing speed. They took Hong Kong, Malaya, Singapore, territories that had long been seen as secure anchors of European power in Asia. Singapore, in particular, had been celebrated as an impregnable fortress. Its surrender, with tens of thousands of British and Commonwealth troops captured, stunned the world. Across Asia and Africa, people watched. They saw European troops marching into prison camps. They heard radio broadcasts in which Japanese propagandists proclaimed the end of white rule in Asia. For many, the lesson was not that Japan should be their new master, but that the old masters could be beaten. The aura of automatic European superiority, already dimmed by the Great War, flickered. By 1945, when the Second World War finally ended, the map looked, at a glance, similar. The British Empire still stretched round the globe. The Union Jack still flew over Delhi and Nairobi, over Hong Kong and Lagos. But inside the system, almost everything had changed. Economically, Britain was exhausted. Reconstruction at home required immense resources, keeping up large garrisons overseas, maintaining fleets, funding colonial administrations. All of this now competed with urgent needs in bomb-scarred cities and ration-weary towns. Politically, colonial subjects had become, in many cases, battle-hardened organisers. Veterans returned with new skills, new contacts, new confidence. They had seen the inside of the imperial war machine, learned its vulnerabilities, felt the power of collective action. Movements for independence that had once seemed marginal or manageable were now mass forces. The Indian National Congress, Muslim League, trade unions, nationalist parties in West and East Africa, anti-colonial groups in the Caribbean and Southeast Asia. Psychologically, both rulers and ruled were transformed. Many Britons, after 6 years of bombing, fear and sacrifice, found it hard to imagine pouring more lives and money into distant territories that now questioned their authority. Many colonized peoples, having fought for freedom in Europe and Asia, were no longer prepared to accept that freedom should stop at their own borders. It is often said that the Second World War marked the beginning of the end of the British Empire, not because flags came down immediately, they did not, but because the balance of power, wealth and belief had shifted. The empire remained, but it was overstretched, indebted and increasingly contested. The structures that had sustained it, economic dominance, military superiority, ideological certainty, were all weakened. In the years that followed, those strains would turn into a wave of decolonization. But the roots of that unravelling lay here, in the trenches of the Somme, the gardens of Amritsar, the streets of Dublin, the deserts of North Africa, the jungles of Burma, the conference rooms where new principles were quietly written down. The empire had helped win the world wars, but in doing so it had also sown the seeds of its own undoing. When the war ended in 1945, Britain still looked, on paper, like a great imperial power. But the reality underneath was very different. The treasury was drained. Cities at home were damaged. The United States and the Soviet Union now towered over the old European states. And in the colonies, people who had fought, worked, and sacrificed during the war were no longer content to wait quietly for reforms that always seemed to arrive late and half-finished. Nowhere was this more true than in India. For decades, Britain had called India the jewel in the crown of the empire. It was more than a poetic phrase. India provided soldiers, raw materials, and a vast market. The entire imperial system was, to a large degree, built around the assumption that India would remain under British control. But by the mid-1940s, that assumption was crumbling. The Quit India movement of 1942, brutally repressed, had shown how deeply the desire for self-rule had spread. The Indian National Congress, under leaders like Gandhi and Nehru, demanded independence. The Muslim League under Muhammad Ali Jinnah, fearing domination in a Hindu-majority state, pushed for a separate homeland for Muslims. Rural unrest, strikes, mutinies in sections of the armed forces all signalled that the old imperial balance of coercion and consent was failing. British officials facing debt, American pressure, and the risk of large-scale revolt began to accept what had once been unthinkable. They would have to leave, but leaving would not be neat. Communal tensions between Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs and others, stoked over years by economic inequalities, political manoeuvring, and sometimes by divide-and-rule tactics, erupted into violence. Negotiations in London and Delhi revolved around a fateful question. Would there be one independent India, or more than one state carved out of the old Raj? In August 1947, the answer took shape on a map: independence and partition. British rule ended. Two new dominions were born, India and Pakistan. In theory, this was a triumph of self-determination, the final act of a long political struggle. In practice, the way it unfolded was chaotic and brutal. Borders were drawn quickly, often with little knowledge of the complex realities on the ground. As new lines were announced, millions of people suddenly found themselves on the wrong side. What followed was one of the largest and most traumatic migrations in human history. Hindus and Sikhs fled from areas that became Pakistan. Muslims fled from regions that remained in India. Trains packed with refugees crossed the new frontiers. Columns of people walked for days across sweltering plains. Along those routes, massacres erupted. Villages burned, families vanished. Estimates of the dead range widely, but many historians believe hundreds of thousands, perhaps more, were killed. For Britain, Indian independence and partition were a paradox. On the one hand, they mark the formal end of direct rule over the empire's central possession. The jewel was gone. Without it, much of the rationale for maintaining a far-flung network of colonies, so often justified as supporting, protecting or supplying India, evaporated. On the other hand, the speed and violence of the withdrawal revealed how fragile imperial control had become. If Britain could not hold India, how long could it hold Kenya, Malaya, Nigeria? The answer turned out to be not very long. In the decade that followed, a wave of independence movements swept across Asia and Africa. Each story was different, shaped by local histories, leaders, and conflicts, but together they formed a pattern, the slow, uneven unravelling of an empire. In West Africa, the Gold Coast had long been a hub of British trade. Cocoa farms, timber, minerals, all tied local economies into imperial circuits. After the war, educated elites and rural organisers increasingly demanded more than advisory councils and gradual reforms. Under the leadership of Kwame Nkrumah, a mass movement pushed for self-government now. Strikes, boycotts, and political mobilisation made colonial rule increasingly costly and unstable. Facing these pressures, and aware that the tide of the world opinion was shifting, Britain agreed to a managed transition. In 1957, the Gold Coast became the independent nation of Ghana, the first sub-Saharan African colony to break free from European rule in the post-war era. Its independence resonated far beyond its borders. Nationalists from Lagos to Nairobi watched closely, drew lessons, took inspiration. Further east, in Malaya, the story was more tangled. Malaya was economically vital with its rubber plantations and tin mines. During the war, Japanese occupation had shattered the myth of British invincibility. After 1945, communist-led guerrillas took to the jungles, fighting what they saw as a continuation of anti-imperialist struggle. The British called it the emergency, a word that avoided the politically explosive term war. Counterinsurgency campaigns, resettlement of rural populations, political reforms, and attempts to divide nationalists from communist forces all became tools of a long-draining conflict. Yet even as the British sought to defeat the guerrillas, they also slowly prepared a path towards self-government. In 1957, the Federation of Malaya achieved independence. Later, after further complex negotiations and conflicts, it would evolve into modern Malaysia. Here too, independence did not come as a single, clean break, but as a series of compromises, power-sharing arrangements, and unfinished arguments. In East Africa, things could be darker still. In Kenya, European settlers had occupied some of the most fertile lands, displacing many Kikuyu and other communities. Grievances over land, labour and racial discrimination deepened over decades. In the 1950s, a militant movement commonly labelled Mau Mau by the British emerged, drawing many of its fighters from dispossessed Kikuyu. What followed was a brutal anti-insurgency campaign. The colonial government declared a state of emergency. Thousands were detained in camps and pipeline systems of interrogation and forced labour. Villages were fenced, populations moved, collective punishments imposed. Violence was committed by guerrillas and by colonial forces. For many years, official narratives in Britain minimised or obscured the scale of abuses. Later research and testimonies would reveal torture, killings, and systematic mistreatment. Yet even this harsh response could not restore the old colonial order. By the early 1960s, it was clear that Kenya, like Ghana and Malaya, would move toward independence. In 1963 it did. Nigeria followed a similar timeline: constitutional conferences, gradual transfer of power, and independence in 1960. Though internal divisions along ethnic, regional and religious lines would soon become painfully evident. Across the map, the same basic arithmetic repeated. Britain was weakened, indebted, and increasingly reliant on American support. It faced populations that were organised, politically active, and aware that the world was changing. The United Nations, with its talk of human rights and self-determination, provided a new global stage on which anti-colonial leaders could speak. The US and the Soviet Union, for their own strategic reasons, often encouraged decolonization, even if they hoped to shape the outcomes. Still, for a time, British leaders clung to the idea that they could remain an independent great power, with a global military presence and a say in all major world affairs. Then came Suez. In 1956, Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, a vital waterway linking Europe to Asian and African trade routes. For Britain and France, who had long seen the canal as a linchpin of their influence, this was a direct challenge. In secret, they conspired with Israel to regain control. Israeli forces attacked Egypt. Britain and France intervened, ostensibly to separate the combatants and secure the canal. On the surface, it looked like a classic imperial move. But the world had changed. The United States, worried about pushing Arab states toward the Soviet camp and annoyed at being kept in the dark, refused to back the operation. The United Nations condemned it. International financial markets reacted nervously. Under intense American pressure, including threats to the British currency, the government in London was forced to back down and withdraw. The Suez Crisis was a humiliation. Militarily, Britain could still project force. Politically and financially, it discovered that it could no longer act as a truly independent imperial power. Any attempt to reassert old-style control risked clashing not only with colonial subjects but also with the new global order shaped by Washington and Moscow. After Suez, the direction of travel became unmistakable. Through the late 1950s and 1960s, more and more colonies moved toward independence. Some transitions were relatively peaceful and negotiated. Others were scarred by violence, coups, and civil wars. By the 1970s, what remained of Britain's direct rule outside Europe was mostly a scattering of small territories, and one major exception, Hong Kong. Hong Kong had a peculiar history. Seized in the 19th century after the Opium Wars, expanded by later treaties and leases, it became a bustling port and financial centre on the edge of a rising China. For much of the 20th century it was seen as a permanent, if unusual, piece of the British imperial puzzle. But this impression was always partly an illusion. Large parts of Hong Kong's territory, the New Territories, had been leased from China for 99 years. That lease was due to expire in 1997. By the 1980s, with China under Deng Xiaoping opening its economy and asserting its sovereignty, negotiations began. The result was an agreement. Britain would hand back Hong Kong in 1997. China promised that the territory would retain a high degree of autonomy, its own legal and economic systems, under a framework described as one country, two systems. On 1 July 1997, the Union Jack came down over Hong Kong. Television cameras captured the moment. For many in Britain, and around the world, it felt like the symbolic closing chapter of formal empire. Of course, some territories remained, Gibraltar, the Falklands, and others. But Hong Kong was the last large populous colony handed back to a non-European power. Yet even as flags changed, something else endured: the Commonwealth. The Commonwealth of Nations grew out of the old imperial structure, particularly the self-governing dominions that had once pledged allegiance to the crown. Over time it expanded to include many former colonies, republics as well as monarchies, all formally equal, all joined voluntarily. On paper, the Commonwealth is not an empire at all. It has no power to command armies, no authority to impose laws. Its members choose to stay or leave. They meet for summits, share programs on education, trade and culture, send athletes to the Commonwealth Games. For some, it offers practical cooperation and a sense of historical continuity repurposed into something more horizontal. For others, it feels like a ghostly echo, an after-image of empire that preserves some of its language, ceremonies and networks while carefully stripping away talk of conquest and subordination. Whether one sees it as a useful forum or as a symbolic relic often depends on where one stands and how one reads the history behind it. And that history is contested. In Britain, memories of our empire are layered and uneven. Some recall railways, parliaments, shared wars, and a sense of global mission. Others prefer not to recall it much at all, treating empire as distant background noise to narratives focused on Europe or domestic reforms. Only in recent years have public debates about slavery, colonial violence and economic exploitation become more widespread, and even then they remain deeply polarized. In many former colonies, the view is different. Empire is not a vague backdrop. It is a central chapter in national stories. People remember land alienation, forced labor, racial hierarchies, famines, massacres, and the everyday humiliations of being ruled by distant strangers. At the same time, they navigate the legacies of imperial institutions, legal systems, borders, languages, and bureaucracies that still shape daily life. Some point to schools and infrastructure and say, "We inherited useful tools." Others respond, "Yes, but at what cost, and for whose benefit were they first built?" There is no single answer, because empire was not a single experience. It meant different things in different places, at different times to different people. Wealth creation for some, dispossession for others, opportunity for a few, constraint for many. And these uneven patterns did not vanish when flags were changed and constitutions rewritten. They linger in trade relationships, in migration patterns, in cultural ties, and in the stories nations tell about themselves. This is why honest reckoning matters, not to assign simple blame or praise, but to understand how a small island's quest for security, profit and prestige created a system that reshaped the world, and how the world in turn reshaped that island, forcing it to let go. The British Empire did not end with a single decisive moment. It faded, fractured, and transformed through independence ceremonies and street protests, through quiet treaties and bitter wars, through financial crises and diplomatic humiliations, until, almost imperceptibly, what had once been an empire became something else, a state among other states, one former centre within a sprawling, complicated global legacy. And that legacy still stretches into the present. Today, that legacy is so woven into the fabric of daily life that it can be hard to see where empire ends and normal begins. Map a line between India and Pakistan, or across the Middle East, or through parts of Africa, and you're often tracing borders first drawn or fixed under British rule. Listen to the global economy at work, the shipping routes, the insurance markets, the financial centres in London, Hong Kong, Singapore, Toronto, Sydney, and you are hearing echoes of old imperial trade networks, repurposed but not entirely erased. Walk through a courtroom in Nairobi, Delhi, Kingston or Auckland, and you may find common law procedures, wigs, titles and legal phrases that flow from Westminster. Sit in a university founded in the 19th or early 20th century, Bombay, Cape Town, Lagos, Melbourne, and you're in institutions originally designed to train clerks, professionals and elites for a British-shaped world. Switch on the news and you will hear English, in countless accents, used as a global lingua franca that began as the language of a small, rain-swept island. You can follow the human currents too. Caribbean communities in London, South Asian families in Birmingham and Vancouver, Nigerians in Manchester, Hong Kongers in Vancouver, Britons in Cape Town and Auckland, diasporas moving along channels first dug by empire, now turned into two-way streets of culture, remittances and memory. Some see these connections as opportunities, shared languages, easier migration, common institutions. Others see them as reminders of extraction and inequality that have never fully been repaired. Because the empire's shadow is not just cultural or institutional, it is economic. Many of the world's deepest inequalities are rooted, at least in part, in how imperial trade, taxation, and land systems were set up. Railways, ports, telegraphs, and plantations were built, but primarily to move goods outward and profits homeward. Famines in India, land dispossession in Kenya, coerced labour in the Caribbean and elsewhere. These were not accidents at the edges of an otherwise benign system. They were woven into how the empire worked. And yet the story is not simple. Those same railways still carry commuters and traders. Those universities now produce critics of empire as well as inheritors of its structures. Former colonies have taken legal systems, parliaments and bureaucracies and tried to bend them toward their own purposes. People live, love, study, joke and dream in English and in the many other languages that survived, adapted or revived despite attempts to marginalize them. Honest history has to hold both truths in view, the creativity and connection, the violence and exploitation. So when we look back from a Britain that is now just one state among many in a crowded world, it is worth remembering how unlikely this whole arc was. A small, often invaded island stitched itself into a global web of conquest, commerce, and administration, rose to rule a quarter of the planet, and then, in less than a lifetime, watched that formal authority dissolve. What remains is not empire in the old sense, but a long-after image. Borders, institutions, habits of thought, and tangled relationships that still shape how power, wealth, and opportunity are distributed. Where you're listening from is part of that story. Maybe you're in a former colony, or in Britain itself, or somewhere far from both, but still touched by the language, the laws, or the trade networks the empire helped spread. If you feel like sharing, leave a comment with the place you're listening from and how this history looks from there. If you'd like to hear more journeys like this, through the strange and often unexpected paths that led to our present, you can support the channel by liking this video, subscribing, and turning on notifications so you don't miss the next one. And if the deeper currents of human history intrigue you, the long, almost unimaginable stretches of time before empires and kings, there's a whole other adventure waiting. We've put together a book about the prehistoric secrets of our species, the kind of story where ice ages and tiny bands of survivors set the stage for everything that came after, including Britain's rise and fall. You can find it at sleepytimehistory.com whenever you're ready to drift a little further back into the past.